Merlin Chowkwanyun is the Donald H. Gemson Assistant Professor in Sociomedical Sciences at Columbia University in New York City. Dr. Chowkwanyun has just brought out a book, All Health Politics is Local, Battles for Community Health in the Mid-Century United States, with the University of North Carolina Press. And a close examination of health politics in New York City, Central Appalachia, Los Angeles, and Cleveland in the 1960s and 1970s, Dr. Chowkwanyun argues that bird's eye views of health politics in the US, often reliant on large aggregate data sets, tend to lose sight of fundamentally important local phenomena and net out all the local activists and local experiences that challenge the paradigms of more powerful actors working on the national level. Dr. Chowkwanyun is currently at work on another book about political unrest at medical schools and neighborhood health activism. He was also the principal investigator on a research grant for Toxic Docs, where one can find millions of pages from once secret documents pertaining to industrial toxins. With Adolph L. Reed, he recently published in the New England Journal of Medicine an article cautioning against the subtle reemergence of myths of racial biology, racial stereotypes, and the stigmatizing of entire territories, and seemingly objective statistics that help to frame COVID-19 as, quote, largely a problem of minorities. So welcome to Syndemic, Dr. Chowkwanyun, or Merlin, I shall call you henceforth.
Thanks for having me. It was really fun to look at some of the previous episodes. It's actually kind of rare to have long form conversations about these kinds of topics, and especially around health. So we're very used to, I think, very short news blasts these days about COVID, but not really sustained kind of exchanges. So it was really fun to kind of look at some of the previous stuff too.
Great, and we're so glad you're joining us. So I guess I'd first like to start off on a very big sort of methodological question about the methodological and disciplinary challenges that relate to your stance as an historian of public health. You brought out a really interesting paper in 2011 on how history has basically completely dropped out of many public health discussions. Ironically, given how centrally historians have played a role in public health, the field of public health in the US before this. So you note that although the field of racial disparities research in public health is booming, what is missing, you write, is a deeper understanding of how and why these social determinants of racial health matter so much, and the long-term process through which they came into being and how they might have been avoided. Or to put this less diplomatically, it seems to me a lot of discussion of public health today drowns the reader in waves upon waves of descriptive statistics, really that don't give you any of the context. So you suggest that many mainstream investigations privilege the quantifiable and, quote, the properties of the freestanding individual in order to squeeze data into pre-established equations. And so therefore we're kind of neglecting fundamental forces and processes that can be better grasped holistically and historically. So here's a three-part question. Take any one of them. First of all, in the 10 plus years since you published this critique, have you noticed anything shifting in what we might call this simplistic pattern of positivism? Are there indications that the chasm between critical historical intelligence and model-driven medical science is closing? And third, do you find some sympathetic audiences for your call for the recognition of history as a, quote, fundamental policy science?
No, that's an excellent set of related questions. I would say in broad general terms, and emphases on those adjectives for reasons that will be apparent in a second. In broad general terms, I don't think much has changed. So my critique, I think, still stands. And I'm not surprised by that. Anybody who has studied organizational inertia and how science is produced knows that those big dominant funding agencies, the ones that give out the most influential kinds of grants that really shape research agendas and how universities operate, but they're very, very, very slow to change, impervious to change sometimes. They are often dominated by people who are embedded in the same tight social networks and who often think the same way. So it's not surprising to me that even if I do see occasional currents suggesting that we've got to be more expansive in how to think about this, it's very, very slow for the funding agencies themselves, who I think are some of the most important stakeholders in all this, to change. And even in qualitative research, to the extent it's actually funded by these agencies, which isn't much, often studies have to be proposed in kind of an A is on this side and B is on this side. So a dependent variable, independent variable kind of framework, or an inputs and then outcomes type framework. So I'll give you an example of this. If you're interested in studying lead poisoning, which continues to actually be a scourge in the United States in some communities, and I assume in Canada as well, you are much more likely to be funded if you can count the number of people who have been exposed to lead poisoning and the adverse health effects that they've studied. That's an important thing to continue cataloging, of course. I'm not saying it is not, but it is ultimately what some would refer to as a downstream effect. And I think what was often missing in that research, despite a lot of rhetorical bluster saying that we need more of this, is the upstream. How did the lead get there in the first place? And why is it still there, even though remediation in the grand scheme of things is not actually that expensive an undertaking relative to all the things we spend lots of money on? So I think that kind of outcomes framework, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, is also still there. But I do see some signs of change. So there are people who don't derive their funding from the big science world, medical anthropologists, sociologists, historians like myself, who I think are actually advancing some really provocative questions on much lower budgets. And the thing that worries me is essentially, I think we have two kind of discourses going on. One that's produced by those kind of more traditional quantitative researchers, and then those scholarship that is produced by those who study institutions, legal regimes, historical processes, and so forth. But I do sense some restlessness with, like you said, just saying the same general story over and over again about racial health disparities and not much beyond that. And I especially see it from students. A lot of students say, particularly students of mine who are students of color, they say a lot of this research is actually bothersome to them because the only depiction that comes forth is that they're a bunch of damaged people, and that's all that's presented to them. And they actually want a story that tells them more about the kinds of power dynamics, political arrangements that create this damage, not just a damaged story itself. So I do see a lot of energy from the student perspective, but it's hard for those old paradigms to fall. I actually pulled up something. If it got just a minute. So this is an example of how some of the funding agencies, especially after the tumultuous events of the past few years, have kind of signaled that, okay, we got to expand our agenda a little bit. But it's also an example at the same time of how that instinct has some limits. So I'll give you this as an example. So after summer of 2020, the National Institutes of Health issued a call for proposals for research on structural racism in health. And, whatever you think about this term, I think this was pretty eye-opening to a lot of people, because the National Institutes of Health, at least in the United States, tends to stay away from terms that have kind of certain normative critiques embedded in them. And structural racism, I think, is such a term. So, I think some people were heartened that the NIH was interested in studying things in this way and was interested in structures, right, and institutions. But then there was this part in the grant, and I wanted to remember exactly what it was. So I pulled it up last night. These are projects that were not eligible for this, not eligible. And so it's a bullet point, and here's one of the bullet points. Projects that are exclusively qualitative or that only use individual level data. Individual level data one I could understand, but to just dismiss exclusively qualitative projects just because of the data type just seemed very, very questionable to me. And then the second one that I thought stuck out was projects that do not examine the impact of structural racism and disparities on health-related outcomes, So there's that kind of obsession again, or that fixation again with the outcome, which is important, but that's not the only thing you can study. The arc of how society affects health is a long one, and the outcomes, measuring the outcomes, are a really, really important part of that. But so is all the other stuff that gets you to the outcome. And sometimes, that stuff is, we as historians know, we're mostly focused on this part, and sometimes and less on that outcomes part. So I think this is an example of how I do see signs of change, but also, institutional strictures are very, very tough. But I do think from the younger generations of students, I see a lot of foment, and I'm very optimistic about that. Yeah.
It's really interesting that you brought up the question, how students of color are objecting to some of this portrayal of them as living in damaged communities, and you're really seeing some pushback on that level, which is a good segue to the second question, which is in 2012 with Adolph Reed, you published Race Class Crisis: The Discourse of Racial Disparity and Its Analytical Discontents. And here, this is a very strongly worded piece. You indict as interpretive pathologies many analyses of disparity made in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, arising from a, quote, distinctive pro forma narrative structure. And among these pathologies, you write, are a schematic juxtaposition of race and class that frequently devolves into unproductive either-or debates, the dilution of class into a cultural and behavioral category, or a static, usually quantitative index of economic attainment that fails to capture power relations, sweeping characterizations of white Americans' racial animus and collective psyche, ahistorical declarations that posit a long and unbroken arc of American racism, and that sidestep careful dissection of how racism, and for that matter, race, have evolved and transformed, and a tendency to shoehorn the United States' racial history into a rhetorically powerful but analytically crude story of two societies, monolithic and monochromatic. So I'm sensing that along with such scholars as Adolph Reed, Toure Reed, Barbara Fields, Karen Fields, Michelle Mitchell, Kenneth Warren, Johanna West, you raise profound questions about how one ought to navigate a very complicated situation in a way. Because in a way, in our time, the scientific reputation of the concept of race has pretty much completely collapsed. Mid-Victorian scientists were convinced that race held the secret to pretty well everything, and you went around and you tell almost everything about anybody from what they thought was their race. And today, that sense of confidence, I say, is outside very select murky places in the net. That confidence in race science is pretty well gone. And yet the paradox is that even though the scientific credibility of race as a concept has collapsed, in much of the world, race has never been more prominent as a category of analysis. You hear it every day, almost all the time. So, from people, I would think, especially the fields core to this school, evoking this concept of race all the time is a little bit like witchcraft. And they use the parallel of, they use the term racecraft, and they say it's a bit like explaining crop failures in terms of witches casting a spell. And a way, this use of outdated racial vocabulary is similarly atavistic and really kind of reactionary. For West, and she writes, even when older schemes of racial classification are seen as outdated and false, the proposed solutions wind up retaining the logic of racial aggregation. So these are really, strong critiques. Do you see your own work as a contribution to this school's critique of racecraft?
Generally, yes. But again, I use the qualifier generally because I was cautious about terms like schools.
Right.
We as historians know that there are intellectual schools that are very tightly bound, and they try to hold the line, and the head of the school tries to get the mentees to propound certain theses. So I don't think there's a line or anything. In fact, of all those people that you mentioned, many of whom were colleagues, teachers, friends of mine, there are probably some subtle differences among us, and maybe some not so subtle differences. But I would say, to the extent we have something in common, it is kind of what you said. It's not to make race and racism, that is, as constructs. It's not to think about them as these static, reified categories that are timeless and contextless and always the same, no matter where you are on Earth and what time period you're in. So unlike a lot of academics, including some historians, I'm pretty averse to any kind of generalized statement about how race works and how important racism is or isn't to larger inequality, because I think that's an empirical question ultimately to be investigated. And the answer to that investigation varies a lot, just depending on the phenomenon that you're looking at, whether it's health or housing or something else, the time and the place you're in. So, this may seem like a little bit of a jump, but, our students use social media a lot, for better or worse, to not just share, pictures of themselves at concerts or whatever, but increasingly to learn about politics. And one of the things that I've never really liked about this, even though I can see some benefits to it, is a lot of kind of aphoristic statements get put on a little square. And, so one statement might be something like, racism is the fundamental force that the United States has been built on, and it always will be. I mean, true enough, but also vague and general enough that it doesn't really actually explain things like what vectors the racism is running through, where it came from, does it ever change, does it cross cut with other axes of inequality, etc. So I'm generally just don't like statements like that, even if they seem self-evident and true, at least initially. I'd rather be very contextually specific. And so I think that's what probably unites those scholars that you mentioned. I also, again, I like to think more of race as it's part of a genus of larger ascriptive categories and labels that people fix to each other. In the United States, that label happens to very much correlate with phenotypical characteristics. In other societies, it's language, religion, the town you grew up in, the little village you grew up in, tribal affiliations, whatever. So I view it as a menu or an item on a menu of many different categories. And the interesting puzzle to me is to figure out why some items on the menu seem to be more salient in some societies or some eras than in others. There's a book that actually influenced me a lot on this, and I don't think he was actually particularly as politically engaged as some of the other scholars you mentioned. I think he was very much more of an academic, but this book by Charles Tilly that came out, I think, in the 90s, called Durable Inequality. And this book he could have written. So basically, he was trying to figure out what are the reasons why inequality forms and why does it seem to really stick, and what are the mechanisms that make it so that people fall on one side or the other in a society. Now, he could have written this book and focused it on just race alone, but he intentionally doesn't do that. And he instead uses just a huge litany of examples from around the world and different time periods. He basically says the one thing in common with all of these examples, heterogeneous as they are, is that basically in societies, lines form. That is the category, and you're either on one side of the line or the other. It can be a gender line, a racial line, a professional, non-professional line. You're in this tribe and not that tribe, etc. But he says, he calls this process categorical inequality. And that's always how I've preferred to think about racial inequality ultimately, is that it is a manifestation of a broader process underneath called categorical inequality. And the onus is on us to figure out exactly why that version of categorical inequality arose. So that's how I think about it. I suspect that's how some of the others you mentioned think about it as well.
You write that at its most simplistic, a bird's eye quantitative analysis of race can leave the reader with figure after figure illustrating disparity and not much else, or only slightly better, a series of plausible just so stories that attempt to fill in the explanatory black holes post hoc. Simplistic use of race as a key analytical category suggests interracial class uniformity and encourages thinking in monochromatic dyads. And then very combatively, you are emphatically critical of the constantly, and I quote you, constantly expanding panoply of neologisms, institutional racism, systemic racism, structural racism, colorblind racism, post-racial racism, etc., intended to graft more complex social dynamics onto a simplistic and frequently psychologistic racism, anti-racism political ontology. So here are some phrases: analytical sloth, a stifling, ready-made narrative, superficial, self-righteous, lazy-minded. I could say that the piece doesn't lack for some fighting words. Some surely will fight back, saying your current of anti-racist thought, if it is indeed a coherent current, disregards the grievous injuries of racism. So does it?
I don't think it does. In fact, quite frankly, I think it does the opposite, and I'll explain why. I think sometimes the complaint is that criticisms of that sort just don't put in neon lights what I talked about earlier, like a very general polemical slogan about how racism explains X or Y. And the reason why is I think that's kind of tautological. X and Y is a quote unquote racist outcome, and you're trying to explain it by deferring to a concept called racism. But I think you got to drill a little deeper than that. So I don't think so. I think what we were trying to do in that article is take a term or a term like that's often used as as kind of a static variable, and disaggregate it to component parts, and most important, get to the processes, whether those processes are tied to the labor market, the housing market, finance, land use, or whatever else. So you can say that if one demographic group in society appears to be disproportionately on average absorbing a burden more so than other groups, that this is racism. But we want to know what the chain of institutions and laws and public policies and collective actions, what resulted in that. So I'm less interested in the word racism than the processes underneath. In public health, I've actually seen in the past few years, people, this kind of to your earlier question about whether things have changed on the racial health disparities front. I said for the most part, no, but I do see some people who are getting a little restless and say we've got to do more than just collect lots of numbers that are really depressing. And so I've seen people, collect numbers that show a racially disparate outcome in, say, heart disease or something like that. And then what they'll do is they'll criticize prior generations of researchers for not labeling this racism. And in fact, there are a number of papers that have come out in health policy journals in the past couple of years saying that racism needs to be a word that is explicitly used in these articles. And for me, I actually find this not particularly satisfying and a little besides the point, because declaring those outcomes racism don't, again, actually elucidate the various specific forces through which that racism is a byproduct of, and that results in these racially patterned outcomes. So I would argue that placing more premium on the processes that constitute what you call racism, in fact, is a lot more important. And in fact, I think it is the opposite of disregarding it. It's actually trying to probe more concretely what it is beyond just using what is actually a pretty elastic construct of racism. And it's for that reason, I'm also a little averse, or for a similar reason, I'm kind of a little averse to constructions like structural racism, which has also seen kind of an uptick in social science, but especially the health literature. This is actually an interesting term, and it would be useful, I think, for people to learn a little bit more about the origins of the term. And it's actually traceable to the 1960s, late 1960s, when more and more activists and academics started realizing that racism often, not always, but often was more than just a psychological hearts and minds problem of individual prejudice, right? So even if you had changed many hearts and minds, why are racially disparate outcomes still intact? And the answer was that many institutions or societal structures, sometimes even without nefarious people in them, could still perpetuate aggregate outcomes that were racially disparate. I thought that's a very interesting idea. And I think that is indeed how a lot of society works to produce those kinds of outcomes. But I also think not all racism works that way. I mean, sometimes it is very much just the result of prejudicial beliefs, or more commonly, the consequences of many individuals collectively holding those prejudicial beliefs and then acting on them. And so I think the task for us as researchers is to figure out exactly what flavor of racism we are dealing with. But having that structural adjective in front of it, I think, nudges you in that one direction. Those are my inclinations, by the way, like structural and institutional thinking more than hearts and minds. But I think that you don't want to actually take your constructs and stuff your thesis into them. The constructs are supposed to serve, in my view, as heuristics that help guide the inquiry, not answer the inquiry before it starts. So this is what I think what the intellectual project is, and I think it's not disregarding racism. It's actually trying to be more specific about what exactly it is and what causes it.